Welcome to the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast, presented by the Beef Cattle Research Council, the most popular content from beefresearch.ca, available on the go. This episode features the BCRC Science Director, Dr. Reynold Bergen.
Hi there, I'm Reynold, and today we're going to talk about overextended grazing. So last month, we talked about a University of Saskatchewan research trial where they used high moisture corn grain or snaplage or silage to partially replace the barley grain or barley silage in finishing diets. Now, while they were doing that, they were also wintering a bunch of cows on all the corn residue that was left out in the field. And so that's what we're going to be talking about here is the extended grazing project they did on the corn stover. Now, the print and online versions of this article have a link to the research paper if you want to look that up for yourself. But this really is an example of how research and life sometimes go. I mean, what they planned to do changed while they were trying to do it. What they planned to do was compare the performance of mature pregnant cows, so 30 to 36 per diet, that were winter grazed on snaplage residue or high moisture corn stover or whole plant barley over 2 years. Now, the corn was harvested in mid-October at 30% moisture. The barley was swathed in mid-August at the hard dough stage, and then they started winter grazing in late November. Feed tests showed that the corn stover contained less protein than the barley did, so the cows that were on the corn stover diets were supplemented with corn distillers grains in both years of the project. The cows that were fed corn stover were given corn distillers grains as an energy supplement as well whenever wind chills dipped below minus 30 Celsius. And the cows that were fed whole plant barley were given corn distillers as an energy supplement during cold weather in year 1, but not in year 2, presumably due to feed tests. And then they measured feed intakes and body weights and body condition scores for as long as they were extended grazing. And the cattle had constant access to windbreaks, water, salt, mineral, and vitamin supplements, and then they were bedded as needed. So what did they learn from this? Well, they learned that winter grazing can be challenging, but you might already know that. So in the first winter, they had a really early snowstorm that just completely flattened and buried all the snaplage residue, and so the cows couldn't graze it, and they just had to throw that part of the project out the window. Now, meanwhile, there were incredibly high winds, and there were geese, and there were deer, and they wreaked havoc on those corn stover windrows. And so that meant a lot of the best nutrition, so the highly digestible leaves and the dropped cobs and shattered grain, those were all gone before the grazing started. Now, the barley swaths were much less impacted by the wind and wildlife, which is a good thing, I guess. And this is important. They used electric fences to control access to the swaths and then moved them every 3 days. Higher fiber levels meant that the cows grazing corn stover couldn't eat as much as the cows that were grazing the barley swaths. But because the supplemental distillers grains were used to make up for the nutritional differences, the corn stover and barley grazed cows gained the same amount of weight and maintained body condition score equally well. And that winter grazing trial had to end early in mid-January because they got so much snow and then a bunch of rain that turned into ice, and it made it impossible for swath grazing to continue. And so in year 2, they approached it differently. Year 2 also happened to be a drought, so that meant they had 75% lower swath barley yields and 50% lower corn stover yields than they did in year 1. But they learned their lesson, and to avoid all that havoc from the wind and wildlife that they'd seen in the previous year, in the second year, they baled it. They baled the corn stover windrows and the barley swaths, and then they fed them in bale feeders. So again, the cows that were fed baled corn stover ate less than the cows that were fed barley green feed. But this time it wasn't just because of all the extra fiber in the corn. This time there was also a lot more moisture in the corn. So the barley green feed, it got baled at 13% moisture. And the high moisture corn grain was harvested at 30% moisture, but there's way more moisture in the stalk and the leaves than there is in the cob. So there was 50% moisture in the stover. And then they baled these swaths immediately afterwards so that they could protect them from the wind and the king's livestock that had gotten into it last year. But because of this really high moisture content of the corn, they ended up with a lot of really moldy and spoiled and frozen solid corn stover bales. And even though they'd added a preservative, a propionic acid, to try to preserve those bales better. But anyway, the cows were unable to pick and choose the best parts out of the corn bales because they were frozen. And so they simply ate whatever they could pull out. And so as a result, the barley green feed cows gained weight. They gained 82 pounds and they maintained body condition. But the cows that were fed corn stover, they didn't gain weight and they lost body condition. And that trial ended in mid-January when they ran out of barley green feed bales. Things might have worked a little differently if they'd used a bale processor, I guess, but you live and learn. So the bottom line is that with appropriate protein and possibly energy supplementation, corn stover can be a useful feed for wintering pregnant cows if the wildlife don't interfere with it. Baling stover under Western Canadian conditions is challenging as the stage of maturity might not allow for sufficient drying to prevent mold and frozen bales. So what does this mean to you? Well, it's kind of a reminder that extended grazing doesn't always go according to plan. Wildlife don't just consume feed, they consume the best feed. And so doing your feed testing on swaths when the grazing begins rather than when the swaths first come down is a better way to evaluate the nutrients that your cows will be eating. And a lot of producers have simply learned that swath grazing just isn't the optimal extended winter grazing strategy when wildlife are in the neighborhood. Mentioned the electric fencing to control access to swaths or the bales, just to make sure that they were giving them 3 days of feed at a time. That's extra work, but it does ensure that the cows don't consume all of the most nutritious cobs or heads or leaves early in the grazing season and then just have to survive on stalks in the depth of winter. It's important to have a plan B. The swaths got deeply buried and frozen the first year. That ended the trial, and a feed shortage ended the second trial early. So make sure you've got stored backup feed in case extended winter grazing becomes impossible. Make sure your cattle are bedded when they need it. Wasted feed will do. Have natural or man-made shelter. Make sure there's clean, loose snow or open water. Frozen dugouts are risky. We've seen cases where, cows can maybe drink from the edge of the dugout or through a chopped hole, but when that freezes over and all the cattle pile onto the ice to drink, they can go through and there can be massive losses. Dugouts are really risky, but they need water, loose snow or open water to help them maintain weight and body condition and to maintain a 365-day calving interval. So doing the small things right is critical to ensure that low-cost winter grazing strategies don't have a longer-term cost on the health, welfare, and productivity of your herd.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. You can find all relevant links and information at beefresearch.ca or in the show notes. The Beef Cattle Research Council is funded by the Canadian Beef Cattle Checkoff and strives for excellence in the production of Canadian beef, cattle, and forage through research, innovation, and extension. Tune in every Tuesday as the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast delivers straightforward insights, expert information, and a wealth of practical knowledge for Canadian beef producers. Subscribe now.